Okay, this video aims to be an introduction to the Punic Wars. The Punic Wars was a series of three wars which were fought between, at that stage, two regions that were emerging as potential superpowers of the ancient world. It was fought between the North African city-state of Carthage and the Italian city-state of Rome. And when the wars were concluded, it paved the way for Rome to become the superpower of the ancient world that we remember it as being today. Now, the influence that Rome and the Roman empires had on our modern world cannot be overemphasized. Even though this war happened over 2,000 years ago, its repercussions and its impact, we still feel it today. Had there not been a Roman Empire, the legal system of most countries today would be completely different. Roman legal system is greatly influential to what we call the Western world, and the West colonized many other regions during the colonial period, and hence Roman law has influenced most of our legal systems, most of our political systems, the languages we speak, the way in which the written word is done, the symbols we use, very, very influenced by Rome. Also Christianity. Had there not been a Roman Empire, the spread, the emergence of Christianity might have been different. When the Roman Empire had reached its pinnacle, it connected three continents: Southern Europe, Western Asia, North Africa, surrounding the Mediterranean Sea. One powerful empire which spread the best technologies from each one of those regions, spread it across, created a very powerful civilization which was so advanced that the people that came after it, after the Roman Empire had fallen, people who lived in many parts that the Roman Empire had originally ruled, lived in a far less technologically advanced age than the people who lived thousands of years prior. People who lived in the Middle Ages in many parts of the world lived inferior to the way in which they lived during the time of the Roman Empire. So the importance of the Roman Empire is something that we can't overemphasize. But would Rome have done what it did? Would it have become as big as it did had it not been for its victories in the three Punic Wars? Because at the beginning of the Punic Wars, there was a major turning point that was about to occur. Two powerful civilizations were both expanding and they're going to come into conflict with one another: Carthage and Rome. And these three wars that took place between them paved the way for Rome to become the superpower that it eventually became, and hence its influence on generations and history to follow. But not only that, even the actual conflicts themselves between Hannibal, the Carthaginian general, and Scipio, the Roman general, who would eventually emerge to combat Hannibal, they've been studied by military generals in generations and generations to follow. Julius Caesar, Napoleon, even today, modern generals still study the tactics of Hannibal and how he fought the Romans. The Punic Wars were one of the largest, most epic conflicts of the ancient world. A lot of what we know about these Punic Wars comes from a Greek scholar named Polybius, who was living in Rome at the time of the Punic Wars, and he recognized the spectacular nature and importance of this conflict when it took place, and he dedicated a large part of his life to communicate to future generations exactly how monumental this war, how important it was, and how this war was fought. He interviewed and spoke to a lot of former soldiers, politicians after the war. He documented the war. Another important scholar is Livy, who wrote much later, after the Punic Wars, at the time in which Roman Empire had reached its pinnacle. We believe today that Livy might have had access to a lot of primary documents that are no longer surviving, and hence both these, Polybius and Livy, their accounts are very, very important to helping us understand the Punic War. It's also important they would have also had their own biases. Polybius would have been a Greek living as a prisoner in Rome, and Livy would have been someone writing to celebrate the glory of Rome. You don't get a lot of Carthaginian perspectives, but nonetheless, they would have written and documented how this war was conducted. And they would have documented the genius of Hannibal and how he fought the Romans. And hence, Hannibal and many of the techniques he used has been studied so thoroughly by generals who have come after him because of the importance. Now, the Punic Wars, even though it happened over 2,000 years ago, a lot of what happened is what we, even in the modern world, will still be in awe of today. For example, in the First Punic War, there was a naval conflict, which the scale of it has never ever been replicated. Even today, there's never been a naval conflict as large as the Battle of Ectimus. So basically, the Punic Wars were the world wars of the ancient world. What exactly were the Punic Wars? It consisted of three wars fought between Carthage and Rome. The First Punic War took place from 264 to 241 BCE. In other words, 264 years before Jesus, and it lasted until 241 years before Jesus was born. Over 20 years. The Second Punic War took place 218 BCE to 201 BCE, and the last Punic War, or the Third Punic War, took place from 149 BCE to 146 BCE. In a nutshell, as Rome was expanding and conquered most of the Italian peninsula, it came into contact with the island of Sicily as Carthage was expanding. And Carthage and Rome fought for control over Sicily. Prior to this, there had not been a history of conflict between the two nations, but we'll explain when we get to the First Punic War what brought them into conflict. But once they did, they recognized quite quickly that it's in their best interest to conquer the other expanding, emerging empire at this stage. And they fought a war which lasted for over 20 years. Carthage had naval superiority, Rome had a superiority in land conflict. And eventually, the Carthaginians sought a peace deal with the Romans, and that concluded the war. Why did the Carthaginians sought a peace deal with the Romans? Because from their perspective, this over 20-year long conflict was not actually working out for them anymore. They're predominantly a merchant society that trades, whereas the Romans is a more warlike society. It's a citizen, it consists of a militia. Citizens are called on to serve in times of conflict, whereas Carthage fought their wars by hiring mercenaries. So as the war dragged on, neither side gained the upper hand, but Carthage decided this was too expensive and it might make sense to seek for a peace deal. The Romans gave them a peace deal, but after they withdrew their army, the Romans then upped the conditions of the peace deal and demanded that the Carthaginians pay more than they originally asked for. And at this stage, Carthage could not do anything because, one, they had disbanded their army. Two, they were fighting another war, a mercenary war. Some of the mercenaries they were paying to fight in the First Punic War, they were unable to pay, and now they're dealing with the rebellion. So you can basically see it as fighting their own soldiers. And in this position of vulnerability, Rome took advantage. That motivated a Carthaginian general who eventually put an end to the mercenary war to seek revenge on Rome. And after the conclusion of the First Punic War, and after he ended the Carthaginian mercenary war, he then went to Spain and he started to conquer parts of Spain. And this general, Hamilcar Barca, had a plan of invading Rome and getting revenge for what the Romans did at the end of the First Punic War. He would die in battle, and eventually his son, Hannibal, would take over. And his son will initiate the Second Punic War, which took place from 218 BCE to 201 BCE. This war is one of the most famous of the Punic Wars. In fact, it's one of the most famous of the ancient world, where Hannibal got an army across the Alps and invaded Rome. And even though he had a smaller force, and even though the Roman army is considered one of the best, he used genius tactics to massacre thousands of Romans, armies much larger than his. And hence, this has gone down, and his battles have gone down in the annals of history as some of the greatest ever because of what he did. However, being in Italy for a period of almost 20 years now, fighting this war, the fact that he didn't have enough supplies, he was unable to march on the city of Rome and sack the city of Rome. This enabled the Romans to be able to recover some of the major defeats that they suffered at the hands of Hannibal, raise an army, and eventually, instead of fighting Hannibal directly in Italy, sent an army back to Africa, to Carthage. And attacking Carthage, Hannibal would have to leave Italy, return back to Carthage. Stage was set for a final battle, the Battle of Zama, between the new Roman general that would emerge now, Scipio Africanus, and Hannibal, and eventually the Romans would emerge victorious, ending the Second Punic War. After the Second Punic War, because of the almost existential threat that Hannibal showed to the Romans would never ever conceived a reality where they came so close to having their city sacked, decided to really up the reparations that they put on Carthage this time. They put very harsh conditions, demanded Carthage pay a large sum of money, prevent Carthage from having another army altogether. But as time passed, Roman generals always saw Carthage as a potential threat to their empire. And at this stage now, Rome is really expanding. It's really becoming the superpower after the Second Punic War. And some politicians felt as long as Carthage exists, it could always be a threat to them. Now, they passed a law that Carthage was not allowed to have another army. They passed a rule, one of the deals of the end of the Second Punic War. But Carthage was being invaded by neighbors and appealed for the Romans for assistance because they were not allowed to raise an army to fight. And when the Roman generals went to Carthage, they were surprised at how quickly Carthage had rebuilt itself after the Second Punic War. And eventually Carthage did have no alternative but to fight the Numidian invaders, and they raised an army. Rome used that as an excuse, and in 149 they attacked Carthage again, initiating the last Punic War. And at the end of the last Punic War, the Third Punic War, they sought to completely destroy Carthage, move the city away, kill all those who weren't killed were taken as slaves. City was burnt to the ground. Salt was planted into the soil so that they could never regrow crop, and they completely destroyed Carthage at the end of the Third Punic War. So that in a nutshell is the three Punic Wars. So now we'll just go into a little bit more detail about each one of them. Before the First Punic War, Rome and Carthage had no history of conflict with one another. In fact, they had even been allies during the Pyrrhic War. However, events on the island of Sicily between both Rome and Carthage are going to bring these two powers into conflict with one another. Carthage was founded in about 814 BCE as a Phoenician colony of Tyre. Phoenicia, modern-day Syria, Israel, and Lebanon, was an area that had a number of city-states who were major merchants, and they had established other trading ports on North Africa and Spain, various ports of the Mediterranean, and one of which was Carthage. But after the Phoenicia and Tyre were invaded by the Babylonians, Carthage began to flourish and began to break its ties off with its original founders, and emerged in its own right as a very, very wealthy, very, very powerful city-state, and it began to expand with its own colonies. By about 264 BCE, Rome had conquered most of the Italian peninsula, and it was now a regional power with no overseas colonies, and Carthage was a sort of powerhouse, one of the most powerful areas in the Western Mediterranean. And these two nations are going to come into fight. Now, the incident that brings them into conflict, whether or not the conflict was inevitable by virtue of the fact that they are expanding in the same area, the actual incident that brings them into conflict is a group of Italian mercenaries called the Mamertines. And the Mamertines were employed in a city on the island of Sicily. And the king who had employed them had relieved them of their duties because he had no use for them. So they went to a nearby city, Messina, and killed all the men and took their wives as their own wives. In other words, they were basically causing trouble in the city of Messina. And as they did this, locals in surrounding cities began to worry about the Mamertines attacking them. So in response, they attacked. And the king of Syracuse attacked the Mamertines. And the Mamertines appealed, and the story goes, one group of them appealed to Carthage and another group appealed to Rome. Basically, they appealed to Carthage with Carthaginian assistance. The Carthaginians came in, and another group of Mamertines were not happy with being ruled by the Carthaginians, so they appealed to Rome. Indirectly, it brought Rome and Carthage into a conflict on the island of Sicily. But once they were in, both these emerging powers would decide that this would be the best time to assert their dominance on the island of Sicily. Now, this war, which begins as almost an accident by these groups of Mamertines, once Rome and Carthage are committed, they then fight, and the war becomes more intense. Rome has the advantage in land conflict But this is their first naval conflict, and Carthage has a far superior navy, and Romans are just not able to compete with them. Now, the story goes that this is a story according to Polybius, who was the Greek scholar living in Rome, who wrote about his experiences. He says that during a storm, a Carthaginian war vessel crashed onto the Italian coast, and the Romans by chance were able to get hold of this war vessel, and then they deconstructed it, learned how the Carthaginians built these ships, and then they built their own fleet. And story is, in 2 months they had built 100 of these ships, having never built them before. Nonetheless, in a naval conflict, they're still not able to really defeat a Carthaginian fleet. The Carthaginians are experienced in this type of conflict, and what they would do is they have a huge ram in the front, they have rowers, and they would ram into a enemy ship and smash it. And the Romans were just not able to, even though they have built their own fleet now, be able to compete with a navy as experienced as the Carthaginians. But what the Romans did instead was they invented something that was called the corvus, which is a kind of a drawbridge, which is a huge bridge with a spike on the end, could be extended on both sides. So as a Carthaginian ship got close to a Roman ship, they'd draw the drawbridge, it would land on the Carthaginian ship and be fixed in place, and then serve as a bridge where the Roman soldiers could get across onto the Carthaginian ship and, in effect, convert a sea battle into a land battle by fighting on the Carthaginian ship. So the Romans used many tactics like this, various battles in the First Punic War. But to summarize, no side really dominated per se. It was very back and forth, disasters for Rome, disasters for Carthage. But as this war dragged on for over 20 years, it became increasingly pointless for the Carthaginians to continue this war. The societies were very different. The Roman society was a society founded on a citizens' militia, army that was committed to war. They had been founded by expanding, getting attacked by their neighbors, conquering their neighbors so that they don't get attacked again, getting bigger, coming into contact with new neighbors who they then fight. So the war was very much entrenched in their culture. Whereas the Carthaginians, on the other hand, were very much concerned with commerce, and they hired mercenaries. So as this war continued, it became more expensive for Carthage to continue fighting this war. Romans were more farming, so they would just continue, produce more soldiers, whereas the Carthaginians, this was expensive, paying mercenaries, affecting their overseas trade. So they decided, rather than continue to draw this war ever longer, it would make sense to come to terms and seek a peace settlement. And they then made a peace settlement with the Romans, and the Romans wanted control of Sicily and demanded that the Carthaginians pay an indemnity, which the Carthaginians accepted. But immediately after the war, the Carthaginians were then faced with another war, which in fact was probably more dangerous to it than the war that they just fought with the Romans, and that was a mercenary war, where they were unable to pay the mercenaries who they had hired to fight against the Romans during the duration of the First Punic War. A Carthaginian general, Hamilcar Barca, played a very important role during the First Punic War, and he felt, he was not defeated by the Romans during the First Punic War. Now he's defending Carthage against these mercenaries. He defeats them as well. And in some regards, you can kind of draw parallels between what happened with Germany in the First World War, where the Germans had, some German soldiers thought that they could not understand why they surrendered to France. They felt like they were on the verge of defeating the French. Then they kind of felt stabbed in the back by the German authorities who for them surrendered to the Allies. And Hamilcar Barca was similar in that regard. But he also wanted revenge against Rome. Once he had ended the mercenary war, he then traveled to Spain. And his plan was, Hamilcar Barca was going to take advantage of Spanish silver mines. So he was going to colonize various areas of Spain, make them Carthaginian colonies, take control of the Spanish silver mines, and use that money to pay back Rome the indemnity. And in fact, when he was expanding into Spain, the Romans were suspicious, and they were asking him, why are you expanding into Spain? And he said, to pay you back the indemnity. But also what's important to note is that when Hamilcar Barca was putting down the mercenary before he went to Spain and started colonizing Spain, he was fighting this mercenary war, and Rome took advantage of that and annexed Sardinia and Corsica, two more islands. And this was a great frustration to Hamilcar as well. So he desperately wanted revenge over Rome. He was frustrated with the Carthaginian government for signing the peace treaty with Rome, but he really wanted revenge against Rome. Hamilcar Barca, he died in battle during his time in Spain. His brother-in-law replaced him, but his brother-in-law was murdered by an insubordinate who he disciplined very harshly. And after his brother-in-law was murdered, his son, so Hamilcar Barca's son, Hannibal Barca, became, at age 26, the commander of this Carthaginian army in Spain. In spite of his young age, he had already developed a reputation that most of the soldiers in Spain had already trusted him. The issue that would spark the Second Punic War would be when Hamilcar Barca's son, Hannibal, sacks the city of Rhegium. Rhegium was a Spanish city that had an alliance with Rome, or Rome strengthened its alliance with Rhegium during Hannibal's expedition in Spain. And when Hannibal was about to sack the city, Rome ordered that he does not, but he nonetheless attacked the city, and that would be violation of Rome's treaty with Rhegium, and hence Rome will attack Hannibal. But Rome did not come to the aid of Rhegium because they were fighting a Gaulish invasion, and while they were distracted, Hannibal sacked the city of Rhegium. Now, the sacking of the city of Rhegium, just something that might be important to note, is later on during the Second Punic War, some people today and some scholars who have studied this would argue that one of the mistakes that Hannibal made was when he had the upper hand during the Second Punic War, he did not sack the city of Rome. But perhaps a reason for this would have been the lessons that he learnt during his sacking of Rhegium. Rhegium would have been a much smaller city than Rome, and he would have been in a better position to sack it. He would have had more siege equipment at this early stage during his expedition in Spain. Nonetheless, he did eventually sack the city of Rhegium, and hence Rome would be forced to declare war on Carthage. And the story goes, due to all the atrocities, well, not atrocities, but due to the way in which Rome treated Carthage after the First Punic War, by upping the reparations, by taking Sardinia and Corsica, the Carthaginians felt a lot of resentment to Rome. So when Rome sent a diplomat to Carthage to tell Carthage to surrender Hannibal, and they refused to, he said, well, if you don't surrender Hannibal, you have an option, war or peace. And the Carthaginians apparently told the Roman diplomat, choose as you will. And the Roman diplomat said, I choose war. And apparently all the Carthaginians present celebrated and cheered this on because they wanted revenge against Rome. Now, as far as the actual battle goes, when this Second Punic War began, Roman strategy was to send an army to Spain and to send an army to Africa through Sicily, because it now has control of Sicily, to attack Carthage. What they did not expect was that Hannibal would attack Rome. He would cross through Europe, cross the Alps, and invade Rome from the north. And the reason why they didn't think that he would do this was it was seen as impossible to get an army across the Alps. Getting a huge army with troops, with horses, with a few war elephants, with supplies, food supplies for these soldiers, would have been seen as something that is impossible to do. But nonetheless, one of the great achievements of Hannibal was that he was so dogged and determined. He got his army, many would have died on the journey, but he got an army across the Alps, and he had arrived in Rome, ready to initiate the Second Punic War. Okay, while I say that Hannibal entered Rome, what I actually mean is that he entered the Italian peninsula. Just a quick note is that there's the city of Rome, which is the one that expanded and come to conquer the Italian peninsula. And that is the city that is Hannibal's ultimate goal of sacking. But to do that, he needs to enter into Italy. And Italy is, well, Rome is surrounded in Italy by Romans, Italian, Latin, and Etruscan allies. So what Hannibal's strategy is to get many of these people to desert Rome and join his forces. When he crosses into the Italian peninsula, after he crosses the Alps, the Roman commander who's tasked to face Hannibal gives his soldiers a speech. And this is documented by the sources, very in-depth speech about how he motivates them to fight Hannibal, but generally underestimates the enemy. Hannibal, on the other hand, at this stage, he's got a number of different groups under his control. Some Spanish soldiers, some African soldiers, some Gallic soldiers, who would be the people that are in the northern Italy area. So instead, he takes those Gallic soldiers who he captured as prisoners, and he tells them that they've got options. They can be a slave for life, or they can have a fight to the death. And the victor would be allowed to go home with his armor and weapons, and the loser would obviously be killed. Now, this has a number of purposes. One, it will help Hannibal get more allies, because these Gallic soldiers who get treated this way, this is a kind of thing that they would respect. The stronger person gets to survive, goes back home, and tells the people, Hannibal's not such a bad guy. Maybe we should join him. He'll help rescue us from the Romans. Romans are our enemies. Also, his troops who watch this, instead of giving a speech, they watch this situation. And it kind of teaches them or shows them what's in order. If they fight in Rome, and the message that Hannibal has to them is that you're now in a fight to the death. If you quit, it's death. But if you succeed, you'll have all the riches of Rome. So this is a kind of motivating factor. And one of the things about Hannibal during this time is that he's a master strategist, and he's also aware of all the different groups that make up his army, and he uses them effectively. He'll purposely situate some troops who are good at certain techniques in certain positions in the battlefield. The first battle that's going to take place is what will be known as the Battle of the Trebia River. Rome will send two consuls, two armies to meet Hannibal, and they'll try and divert Hannibal into a trap. Now, in this video so far, I've been using the word general and politician interchangeably, but Rome's political structure, I don't want to go into too much detail now, but basically Rome is ruled by two consuls. Instead of having one prime minister or one president, each year Rome elects two consuls, who it's kind of a balance of power thing, but they also command the armies. And this also is a factor that kind of motivates them to be more warlike, because a Roman consul always wants prestige of winning a war. So if you lead a battle and you win, you get a triumph and you get a lot of prestige. So it is a motivating factor. But anyway, these two consuls go to meet Hannibal, and the first battle would be what is known as the Battle of the Trebia River. And this is one of the Romans' first taste of Hannibal's genius. Now, just prior to this, a cavalry skirmish had occurred, and Scipio, who was one of the Roman generals, his son, Scipio Africanus, will be the one who ultimately defeat Hannibal. But he had a bad encounter where in this cavalry skirmish, he saw the enemy that the Romans were about to face. But nonetheless, in this Battle of the Trebia River, not taking this warning, the Roman consul who's going to meet Hannibal, they both set up camps with the river between both sides. Hannibal has a strategy. Quietly, he sends his brother Mago to set up a camp near the Romans, hide in a deserted riverbed where they can't be seen. Then he orders his troops to wake up very, very early while the Romans are still sleeping. He gets them ready. They ready across the river for a battle. He orders his light cavalry to cross the river and go and wake the Romans up and harass them. And that's what they do. And the Romans get woken up, not fed, not really ready for battle, but they get attacked by this light cavalry, which is harassing them. So they assemble and they chase this cavalry, and the cavalry crosses the river. Then the Romans chase the cavalry across the ice-cold river in the morning, and when they cross the river, suddenly they come into contact with Hannibal's army, ready to engage with them. Hannibal would put his infantry in the middle and cavalry on both flanks. Now the Roman forces, just caught unprepared, cross this freezing cold river and are now forced to fight a Carthaginian army which is waiting for them. At that moment, Mago's, Hannibal's brothers, ambush strikes, and they catch the Romans off guard, and the Carthaginians attack. It's a total massacre. Huge Roman defeat. Immediately after, there's another major battle where the other consul is tracking Hannibal down. And this time, both armies will meet near what is Lake Trasimene. And Lake Trasimene, there's a huge lake. Once again, Hannibal very smartly observes the battleground, orders his troops on the hill. There's a very, very narrow pass. As the Roman soldiers are crossing it, they light fires to distract the Romans. Romans think Hannibal's troops are there, and they get caught between the lake and the hill. Hannibal's troops come in and basically, once again, annihilate the Roman forces. Two major defeats. These are thousands of people who are killed in both battles. This is a type of disaster that would cripple many other armies of the ancient world. But the Romans, nonetheless, managed to recoup. And in this state of crisis, with both of their consuls killed, now remember, Rome is ruled by two, instead of presidents or prime ministers, they're called consuls. They elect what is called a dictator. Now, today we have a negative connotation of the word dictator. In Roman times, they would put a dictator in charge if in a time of crisis. And the dictator who's in charge of Rome at this time, his name is Fabius. And Fabius realizes the best way of fighting Hannibal, and that is to do something that's very anti-Roman. Every time you assemble a large army and fight Hannibal in the open, he uses ingenuity and he'll massacre your army. So what Fabian decides is that this is a very bad strategy. Instead, treat Hannibal's army, and the phrase I borrow from Dan Carlin, who has a very excellent podcast on the series, says Fabius' strategy was to treat the Carthaginian army as a big bear and attack it like a pack of wolves. Instead of hitting it directly on, is to use more guerrilla warfare tactics, assemble a small force, cause some trouble here, attack some of the Italians that Hannibal is trying to align himself with, get the Carthaginian force to go there, then attack somewhere else, and basically stall the conflict. This would give Rome some time to recover. It will slowly weaken Hannibal's force, because remember, Hannibal is now in Italy, far away from Carthage. He has to live off the Italian land. He has a limited amount of resources available to him. So the more stalling, the more it will benefit Rome. The more assemble large army, fight Hannibal directly, the more you're going to get massacred, and Hannibal's just going to waste Roman lives. So this is an effective strategy, but it's a very anti-Roman strategy. And the Romans like direct conflict, and they're very, very frustrated with this, even though it's actually working for them. And instead they call Fabius, in a derogatory way, Fabius the delayer, because they don't like this type of conflict. But Fabius' strategy is actually very important, considering how many Romans have died. The Battle of the Trebia and the Battle of Lake Trasimene, you could say that close to 40,000 Romans have died. So many Romans died that, in fact, Hannibal, and archaeologists have found these giant pits, which they believe that Hannibal used. He built these pits during this time, and he burnt the dead Roman body to stop the amount of pollution from all these rotting Roman carcasses, just to give some perspective of the scale of the death. But nonetheless, the Romans were fed up with this delaying tactic, and in 216 BCE, when Hannibal was low on grain supplies, he went to an area of Italy called Cannae, and he went there to raid its grain supplies, and the Romans would be aware of this. And Cannae is a nice open battleground. So the idea was that in Cannae, they would be able to fight Hannibal head on. The idea is that prior with the Battle of the Trebia River and Lake Trasimene, Hannibal was able to use tricks, but now head on, open battlefield, a force of 80,000 Romans against a force of 50,000 of Hannibal soldiers, made up of Gauls, made up of Africans, made up of various different groups. The Romans, with the superior number, would be able to swarm Hannibal and defeat him the Roman way. But Hannibal, once again, was able to set the battlefield to his advantage. And this is, Battle of Cannae is one of the ways in which Hannibal's true genius was actually displayed. In many conflicts around the world, you have the enemy circle, well, you have one side circle the enemy and enclose them. But that always happens when a bigger army versus a smaller army. Hannibal was able to make a smaller army encircle a larger army. And how he did this? Well, first of all, he set the battlefield up so that the wind would be blowing into the Romans as the Romans headed off. Then he also had, in the middle of his line, he had his Gallic troops. And on the flanks, he had the Carthaginian troops. And around them, he had the cavalry. So as the Romans came forth and they charged in the Roman way, they thought that they could, especially one success that they had in the Battle of Trebia and the Battle of Lake Trasimene, is they felt that they could break through the Carthaginian line. So they came head on and they started to push those Gallic soldiers in the middle, further and further back. But as they were doing this, they were losing the cavalry battles. So the Carthaginian heavy cavalry managed to chase away the Roman cavalry, turn around and attack the Roman light cavalry, free up their light cavalry, and then be able to surround the Roman infantry from behind. And as they were about to do that, what was happening is the Romans were pushing the Gallic soldiers further and further back, but the Carthaginian soldiers on the flank began to surround, so a crescent was forming, and the Romans were pushing themselves into this crescent, which was beginning to close up. Then the cavalry will come at the back, and suddenly, before you know it, this force of 80,000 Romans are trapped. They're encircled, and the Carthaginians basically crush them. And in this type of environment, they're not able to move, and those Roman soldiers in the middle are basically just squashed. And this is something that's very hard to imagine. I know Dan Carlin, who I reference because some of this video I got from a lot of his information, speaks about just how difficult this is to imagine, because when you got 80,000 people surrounded by the Carthaginian force, these people still have to be killed. They can't move because they are surrounded. There's no way for them to pull their arms out and stab or do anything like that. And they're basically just waiting to be killed. And this killing is going to take several hours to be completed, because to kill 80,000 people will be a long, long drawn out process. The result of the Battle of Cannae is about close to 50,000 Roman soldiers killed and close to 20,000 taken as prisoners. This was a massive disaster for Rome. But after this battle, Hannibal made the decision not to sack the city of Rome. And today, many historians believe that this is the error he made. He should have attacked. His generals said, now's the time to attack. The Romans have just lost this gigantic army. They are in their weakest position. If we attack now, there's nothing they can do. But remember, Hannibal had, back in Spain, before crossing the Alps, while he still had access to siege equipment, while he was more prepared if anything else, it took him about 8 months to sack the city of Saguntum. The city of Saguntum is much smaller than the city of Rome. And Hannibal believed that in that situation, it would be too difficult to sack the city of Rome. And he was going to continue a strategy of getting more and more allies and slowly breaking the Roman spirit, rather than head on and attack the city of Rome. The city of Rome would have had perhaps 1 million people living within it. It would have been very, very difficult for Hannibal, especially lacking siege equipment, to try and sack the city of Rome. So he made the decision not to sack the city of Rome. Instead, he sent his brother back to Carthage. And the story is his brother, with all the Romans who were killed during this conflict, they had a ring, and he took all these, especially the top politicians, the patrician, they would wear a ring. So he took all these rings and apparently went to the Carthaginian Senate and he threw the rings on the floor to show the success, and everyone clapped. And he requested more funds, more resources. But the Carthaginian government did not give Hannibal enough of what he required to be able to continue or to be able to sack the city of Rome. But now the war would drag on for a lot longer, and Hannibal would have a lot of success, but the Romans would go back to using the strategy of Fabius, where they would use Hannibal's strategy against him. Whereas Hannibal is now making allies with the various Italian cities that surround the city of Rome, he now he's responsible for those allies. So the Fabian strategy is attack one city as Hannibal's army comes in, disperse, send another small force to attack another city. So in this way, it distracts Hannibal for a few more years. And then Romans eventually, Scipio Africanus will be the new general that emerges. He'll go to Spain and he'll attack the Spanish allies of Hannibal. Hannibal's brother would be fighting with Scipio, and apparently Hannibal's brother would be killed in the battle. They'll take his head and send a man on horseback to Hannibal's camp and throw the head of his dead brother at Hannibal to send a message. Eventually, Rome would send a force to Carthage and start attacking Carthage. When they do this, the Carthaginian government, facing serious problem, are forced to call Hannibal back from Italy back to Carthage to defend it. Major battle happens between Scipio's Roman forces and Hannibal's Carthaginian forces. At this stage, Scipio the Younger, Scipio Africanus as he becomes known, he studied as a young person, observed his father who's been battling Hannibal, learned many of Hannibal's tactics in Africa. They had a number of different strategies. One of the things that the Carthaginians used were war elephants. When they first used it against the Romans in the Battle of Trebia, it was overwhelming. But by this stage, they had learned techniques on how to deal with elephants. They would assemble their infantry to form into a corridor, and the elephant charging through would go through that corridor and not actually be as damaging as they could be. And Hannibal would eventually lose the Battle of Zama. Romans would recover, and eventually the Romans would win the Second Punic War. Something I just brushed over quickly is that after the Battle of Cannae, when Rome looked like they were on the verge of defeat, they got so desperate that they raided all their temples, found all museums, found all old armor that they could. They armed the citizens. They took people who were too young to generally be soldiers. They even freed slaves to be fighting on behalf of the Roman army because of the numbers, the losses that they had. But basically, they were able to defeat Hannibal by just being determined and just refusing to give up. And Hannibal was not able to sack the city of Rome because of, well, he felt that, lacking siege equipment, this would be an impossible task. So he didn't do it after the Battle of Cannae. Later on, during the next years that followed before the Battle of Zama, he attempted to sack the city of Rome unsuccessfully. But a lot of historians today will say, had he sacked it immediately after the Battle of Cannae, he might have won the Punic War. Neither here nor there, but he had good reasons for not taking the risk of sacking the city of Rome. After the Second Punic War in 201 BCE, Rome pursued Hannibal, who went in exile until he eventually killed himself by drinking poison so that he would never be captured by the Romans. As for Carthage, Carthage was forced to pay a very, very heavy indemnity this time, and they were also forbidden from going to war without Rome's permission. They were only allowed to fight defensive wars. This would be exploited by Massinissa, a Numidian king. So another king who lived in North Africa, who was Numidian. He was an ally of Rome, and he used this opportunity to continue to harass and attack the Carthaginians. Carthage eventually assembled an army to defend themselves. A Roman diplomat was sent to Carthage, and when he arrived, he saw the wealth that Carthage had and was surprised at how quickly, after the Second Punic War, Carthage managed to recover. And there were a lot of factions within Rome that wanted an excuse to go to war. So this was used as an excuse, the fact that Carthage raised an armed force. So Rome put very harsh conditions on Carthage. They demanded that they surrender all their weapons to the Romans, and condition after condition the Carthaginians accepted, until they were eventually told that they had to move their city from the coastline. So basically they had to move the whole city 16 kilometers away from where it was. And this was too much. It would be more or less the equivalent of destroying their city. So at that point they refused, and Rome besieged Carthage for the next 3 years. It would be Romans fighting Carthaginians until they eventually defeated Carthage. And once they defeated Carthage, they burnt the city. They enslaved all the survivors. A story that is commonly told is that they also put salt into the earth, and the rationale behind that was to stop the land from ever being fertile again. This is disputed by most people and regarded as a myth today, because none of the primary sources make mention to this. It's a story that is often repeated about what Rome did to Carthage, but in neither Polybius nor Livy mention the salting of the earth. There's no real documentation for that, so that is today regarded as a myth. But that in a nutshell is the 3 Punic Wars. I did brush over quite a lot of important information, but this video is mainly designed just to be an introduction to the Punic Wars. There's a lot of other sources that you could use to fill in the gaps and really get into more detail. Hopefully this just stimulated people's interest in the topic of the 3 Punic Wars.